How far would a country go to reclaim its former colonies? In an unexpected and bold move, France has sent military forces into Ivory Coast, aiming to take control of the West African nation. This daring step raises a crucial question. Is France attempting to regain its colonial power in a world that has long moved beyond such ambitions? The very idea seems out of place in the 21st century, but is it really? Could there be a deeper agenda behind this action that goes beyond mere military presence? Today, we'll uncover the truth behind France's intervention in Ivory Coast and its broader implications for Africa's future. Stay tuned to understand how this might affect Africa's development and geopolitical landscape. But before we dive in, make sure to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell icon to stay updated with more insightful videos from the African web. Let's get started. At first glance, France's deployment of military forces to Ivory Coast might appear like a standard security operation. The Tonnerre, one of France's largest warships, arrived in Abidjan under the banner of fighting illegal fishing, drug trafficking, and piracy. But does this story add up? Could such a massive show of military power really be about maritime threats? Or is there a much larger agenda hidden behind these actions? This raises the question, is France protecting its own economic and strategic interests in the region? To fully understand the context, we must first look at the long and complicated history between France and its former colonies in Africa. Even after gaining independence, many of these nations remained tied to France economically and politically, often in ways that limit their true autonomy. In particular, West Africa has been a region where France has consistently exerted its influence, both openly and covertly, through mechanisms like military agreements, economic dependencies, and diplomatic influence. The significance of the Gulf of Guinea cannot be overlooked. This region, where Ivory Coast is strategically located, holds vast reserves of oil, gas, and natural resources critical to global supply chains. Countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea sit at the heart of this resource-rich corridor. The West, particularly nations like France, has a deep interest in maintaining control over these resources, as they play a crucial role in fueling Western economies. Could it be that France's military presence in Ivory Coast is less about security concerns and more about securing its access to these resources? The answer becomes clearer when we examine the broader geopolitical landscape. Africa has become a new battleground for global powers, each vying for influence and access to the continent's wealth. While France maintains historical ties, other players have entered the scene, most notably China. Over the past 2 decades, China has built a significant presence in Africa through trade deals, infrastructure projects, and investments, often positioning itself as a development partner. China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, has financed infrastructure development across the continent, from roads to ports. With China's rising influence in Africa, could France's military intervention be a reaction to this competition? After all, China's approach to Africa, focused on investment rather than military involvement, poses a direct challenge to France's traditional role in the region. Historically, France has maintained its dominance in West Africa through tools like the CFA franc, a currency still used by 14 West and Central African nations. The CFA franc ties these countries to France's economic policies, limiting their monetary sovereignty and forcing them to rely on Paris for financial stability. Despite growing calls for reform and independence, the CFA franc remains a symbol of France's lingering control over its former colonies. Now, with France's military presence in Ivory Coast, could we be seeing a new form of intervention, one that combines both economic and military influence to maintain dominance in Africa? While France claims its military mission in Ivory Coast is about combating illegal activities like drug trafficking and piracy, many experts believe this is only part of the story. The Gulf of Guinea, rich with natural resources, has become a critical area for global powers seeking to secure energy supplies. Oil reserves in particular are essential to Western economies, and the growing instability in the region poses a threat to those supplies. By sending the Tonnerre and its troops, France ensures its influence over this vital area, thereby protecting its own economic interests. But is this presence really helping Africa? Or is it simply reinforcing Africa's dependency on foreign powers? Moreover, this intervention raises serious questions about African sovereignty. Shouldn't African nations be focusing on building their own security infrastructures, rather than relying on foreign military aid? Several African countries, including Ivory Coast, have taken significant steps to enhance their naval capabilities and protect their maritime borders. But as long as France continues to play a dominant role, can Africa truly claim independence in managing its own security and resources? The broader implications for Africa's development cannot be ignored. For decades, African resources have been exploited by foreign powers, often with little benefit to the local population. From oil and minerals to agricultural products, Africa's wealth has flowed out of the continent, enriching foreign economies while leaving many African nations impoverished. The situation in the Gulf of Guinea is a prime example of this dynamic. If African nations cannot regain control of their resources, how can they hope to break free from the cycle of underdevelopment and dependency? African leaders have increasingly voiced concerns about the impact of foreign military presence on the continent. Many argue that true development and progress can only be achieved when African nations are in control of their own destinies. This means reducing reliance on foreign powers and strengthening internal systems, be it in security, governance, or the economy. France's intervention in Ivory Coast, while framed as a mission to help, could ultimately be a setback for the region's quest for self-determination. As the world shifts towards a multipolar system, Africa finds itself at a crossroads. Will it continue to be a battleground for global powers, or will it seize the opportunity to assert its independence and control over its vast resources? This is not just a question for Ivory Coast, but for the entire continent. Africa's future development hinges on its ability to break free from the historical chains of colonialism and neocolonialism. Can African nations, together, resist the pressures of external forces and chart a new course for the continent's prosperity? In the midst of these challenges, there are glimmers of hope. Many African countries are beginning to strengthen regional cooperation, focusing on shared security and economic development. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area represent a major step forward, aiming to boost intra-African trade and reduce reliance on external powers. Could these regional efforts be the key to unlocking Africa's potential? And what role will countries like Ivory Coast play in leading this movement toward greater autonomy and prosperity? As Africa navigates these complex dynamics, one thing is clear: the continent's future is in its own hands. But will African nations have the strength and unity to push back against foreign intervention and assert their own vision for the future? So, what do you think? Is France's military presence in Ivory Coast truly about providing security? Or is it a strategic move to maintain control over Africa's resources? How can African nations move toward true independence and economic sovereignty in the face of such challenges? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video thought-provoking, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the African Web. Your support helps us continue delivering content that explores Africa's history, current affairs, and future progress. And before you go, here's something to think about. As Africa's resources continue to attract global powers, will the continent rise to the challenge of managing its own future, or will it remain under the influence of external forces? The answer lies in the hands of African nations and their leaders.